Don't want to miss a thing.
I brought a nice show and tell too.
Oh, so you can
various of the components of the process. So it's 6:01, so I will get started. Greetings everyone, I'm Dwight Baxick, doing bronze casting for 12 years. It's been a fun, crazy 12 years. I learned originally from an old man in Kalamazoo, Butch Honek, who did a beautiful job in a tiny shed in his backyard. Before that, I would go to the big foundries around the country where you've got 20 people working professionally and you do a great job, but it's like you could spend $10,000 on one life-size bronze, just to have the foundry cast it for you. That's one of the reasons why they cost so much. I thought, oh my God, that's a lot. And I learned later that bronze is $5 a pound. So it's like there was a little disparity between, well, if that's 200 or 300 pounds, 300 times 5 is $1,500. Where does the other $8,500 go? And it's like, oh, they do a lot of work for that, but it's because there's a ton of steps involved, not because the materials cost that much. So I started a little bit, I learned from Butch, I learned from other places, and I can probably cast a life size for 5,000 for 3 to 5 depending on the complexity of it, which is a third of that. And for some of the stuff I go on to wait 6 months to a year for those professional foundries to do the work. Now, what I'm going to talk about, the process is, you're going to get some fairly decent results. It's, to be fair, not going to be as good as the professionals do with induction melters and all the other million-dollar equipment they have. But it's going to be better than the Rodon bronzes that you go to the DIA and see that they cast 200 years ago. So you're going to do better than those older bronzes, and that's going to be good enough for most arts applications. It certainly was for me. I've got that bronze and glass statue out in the atrium. I was very happy with the results. We're going to do this in 3 sections. The first half hour, we're going to talk about all the steps involved from sculpting to casting of regular sized bronzes such as these. Second, we're going to talk about the equipment, how to make your own equipment, cheap ways, shortcuts you can do to get away so that the whole process you can do for less than that $10,000, probably $5,000. And a TIG welder is actually the biggest, most expensive piece involved there. And then the third section of this slideshow is going to be on how to do big sculptures over life size, because most of those big ones, they don't cast at that size. They cast it in smaller pieces and then just slowly assemble and weld them into the big stuff. And if they can do that, you can do it too. So,
do you talk about this stuff online at all?
Which stuff online?
What you're talking here now?
No. I am videotaping it, so we're gonna eventually have some YouTube videos of the stuff.
All right.
But not yet.
You have a website?
That's julianbronze.com, julianglass.com, and nethercraft.com. We've got a lot of different sculpture projects going in different areas.
And where are you located?
Southfield, Michigan.
Okay, very good.
What we're looking at here is the first step in the casting process. You've got some models done, and you're going to make duplicates in wax. So you're going to first build a rough box around them and pour in some rubber. In this case, this is a urethane rubber. Some folks like to use silicone rubbers. Urethanes are cheaper. It's like $40 a gallon versus maybe 70 to 80 for the silicons, depending on who you buy from. Polytech and Smooth On are some of the more better known places. They're actually used to be the same company. Guy broke off from Smooth On to form Polytech, but most of the chemistry, most of the quality is just the same. You'll not need silicons for most of this. Both of them come in different stiffness, and when you're doing wax casting, you're going to want a really soft rubber, so go for the Shore 30D, which is the softer stuff. That's the D series is how they break it up. 40 and 50. 60D is really stiff stuff. It's good for high impact uses, but not for this, because you're going to end up cracking your wax into many pieces if you use that. So pick up a softer rubber and use it for that. After this thing was cast around the originals, it was cut off. And we've got a really jagged cut there. We always want to do that so that when you put the two halves of rubber back together, it doesn't slide around. Even if you clamp them together, especially if you've applied some release agent, a little bit of oil in there for letting the waxes pull out nicely, it's going to slide a little bit. So you've got to have these registration keys going along to keep them securely in place. You can get away with duct taping the whole thing together, but there's sometimes a risk that at the center area, the pressure of wax will push the two halves apart. So for most of these, you'll take two boards and clamp them together very lightly. You don't want to put too much pressure clamping because you're going to squish the rubber out and that'll deform the piece.
This is if you're going to do multiples of the same image.
Not even. If you're going to do a single of the same image, it's easier to do a sculpture in modeling clay. Some people use wood or anything else. And if you use anything but wax, you got to translate that into a wax to cast your bronzes from.
But would you need this rubber mold? I mean, you can't pour the bronze into the rubber, right?
We're getting there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So once you've got your rubber mold, you're going to go ahead and start pouring some waxes in. You can see down here, I'm going to slide it up a little bit more evident what we got down here, where we've taken duct tape and we've wrapped a small simple mold together, and then we've poured wax in, and then we'll wait maybe an hour for that wax to solidify. You don't actually want to pour the whole thing at once because wax shrinks as it cools. And if you pour the whole thing, the larger areas that cool last are going to cavitate. It'll pull away from the surface and it'll kind of screw up your casting. So what you'll do is you'll pour wax maybe this far, wait 10 minutes, pour a little bit more, and slowly work your way up so that it solidifies from the bottom up, pulling wax down gradually as you go. You get flawless castings that way. For very complicated pieces, where you've got, maybe if you've got like a hand shape like this, you're going to have to cut little air vents in there so that wherever you pour down the wax, it can rise back up without having voids because of air trapped in the mold. Another trick to do is once you've poured it full, you'll spin it round. This is also an important thing because you don't always want to have solid castings. If you want to do hollow castings, let me show you this guy. This is a little bust of Aeneas, about 6 inches tall, and this is pretty thick. We don't want to cast it completely in wax. So we've got a hole here, and after the two halves of this mold are clamped together, here we have rubber inside of a shell, and I'll get a little bit more detail into that later. We'll fill this up with the hot wax, and we'll pour it out this way. And I'll rotate the mold slowly to get a uniform shell of wax around the inside. Now that shell is only going to be a 1/16 of an inch thick, and we want it a 1/4 of an inch thick. So after this cools for half an hour, I'll go back and I'll pour a second time, pour it out a second time, 5 times all together. Now it's important detail on making these hollow castings in wax that we control the temperature of the wax. We want it hot, around 105 Celsius for that first one. So any of the details on the surface don't have trapped air. We need a very thin, low viscosity wax for that. The problem with that, if we go into a second and third layer, I'm pouring wax straight down, wherever it hits, it's going to remelt the surface of what I already have cooled in there. So that second pass with wax, I want the temperature about 80 Celsius, and then the third, fourth, and fifth, 70 to 71 Celsius, where it's just barely molten. So we've done that cast. Now we've got pieces that we're going to assemble prior to the shell building process. Here we've got various people working on different wax processes. Once a year I'll have a seminar where people will come in, they'll do sculptures in wax, and then we'll help them to go through the whole process, and a week later they'll have bronzes they can take home. She's got a large piece and then 2 smaller pieces here. This is the sprue tree that we use for the basis of the casting process. We've got a metal column clamped into a vise here. This is a styrofoam cup. Ultimately, we'll be pouring the bronze into this area. And then this is a long column of wax. This is brown wax from a jeweler's supply And you can also use microcrystalline wax, which is a good one. I'd stay away from beeswax and paraffin, which have various problems. The beeswax will leave a lot of impurities, so after burnout you can have some crusty surface, some imperfections. And the paraffin doesn't have those imperfections, but it's relatively brittle, so it won't hold up to a lot of stress. It's harder to carve. Too many other issues with the carving and gluing of that paraffin, so go with the good waxes if you can afford it. It's still relatively not too expensive. $50 gives you a very large slab of wax of either of those kinds. For the sculpture large stuff, I'll even mix them. Sometimes the AB55, which is a great type of wax, available through Ball Consulting. Forget their specific web address, but we can find it easy enough afterward. Anyway, we'll mix the stiffer waxes with the softer one to get about the right consistency. You want the really stiff waxes for very detailed pieces, but you can't go with large sections on the stiff stuff without risk of it snapping if you try to flex it at all. So to attach it to this column, we're using a soldering iron here. So once she sets it on here, she's going to stab in with that soldering iron to melt the hole into her face. And often for these big pieces, you'll also take a couple toothpicks or little slivers of wood right at that joint, so that later on, when it's in the shell building process where there are a lot of stresses, it doesn't snap off, and that'll save us a lot of headaches later. We talked about casting some hollows, like the Aeneas sculpture I had here. The Aeneas is a little simpler because once we've cast the hollow, I've got a whole bottom here, but sometimes you're going to want to cast a person or an animal where you don't have an open bottom. You still want to be able to address that center area so that it's not a solid bronze, because it's a kind of a wasted bronze, and it's hard to achieve a flawless surface when it's a very thick casting. So we're going to cast a core, which is to say we're cutting a side out of that in a relatively low detail area. We're going to put in some pins here, here, and all along the outside areas, and then we're going to pour in gypsum, a plaster essentially. Ransom and Randolph sells a beautiful core mix, which is slightly spongier than the normal plaster flint investment, and it's got micro strands of glass mixed in, so after it pours in, there's much less risk of that core piece cracking off at some of the stress points. I've put some asterisks in these areas here. We're going to talk about these later, about cavitation problems in bronze. We're going to have to give special attention to these later on. But for now, this is how we cast the core, and we'll move on to sprueing this thing once that core is in your wax. Especially the bottom there. So, in this diagram, we've got a steel column here, which is very important for handling this whole thing, because as the weight accumulates, you don't want to be just grabbing it, especially with our air vents. These are pieces of wax that we're going to add on now, so that when we get to the bronze casting process, bronze is going to flow down here, and then it's going to come into our piece, and air is going to be pushed out here. We've got one here, but not one here, and this arm, because this arm is going to be part of the intake. This is our core pins. And up here we've got two. It is important, even if you only have one bottom of this thing, to have two different air vents coming up. Because when you have only one on this thing, sometimes there'll be shear stress on this. As you work it back and forth, you don't want this thing to flex in this direction and start cracking off these. So if I have two different things here mounted to two different points at the top of the cup, you get this triangle when viewed from the top, and it's this much more stable structure. Very helpful to do that. You know, for the feed, I've also added one here. So technically bronze, as it flows in here, will flow in here, but because it's an upward angle, I get minimal bronze coming in. But I really wanted this connector here because I've got a lot here that was unconnected to this. So everywhere I can get away with adding a little support makes this a much stronger structure. two important little nubs here. You can get away with 1 or 4 depending, but you want to weld onto your steel a couple registration keys so this whole column of steel doesn't start twisting in there. If you don't have those, there's a risk later when you're grabbing the whole thing by the steel and dip it into your investment that the wax may start sliding off of there, and then you're kind of screwed. So you want to make sure that this is stably connected here. These are very well connected at the top, very well connected here. Everything's got to be properly connected. That's one of the reasons those professional foundries get the big bucks, because they don't screw this up. They know exactly how much needs to go on there, and you're going to have a little bit of trial and error. You're going to probably lose a few pieces if you don't properly connect those. Over here we have the piece that we cut out from here. After you've cut it out to make that core space, you certainly want to have that piece cast in bronze at the same time, so that after all the casting is done, you can take this piece and weld it back in here, so you have a completed piece. Down here, I've changed something. I'm going to slide this up so I can illustrate another aspect of this process. Let's say I wanted to have 2 heads on this little character instead of 1. On the other one, I had 1 head, and the core mixture came into void inside the head. But if I break this up, I've got not enough neck space to admit the core investment into here and here, these 2 heads. So I can either core them separately, or I can just cast them solid. Casting solid in a complex structure is often necessary. So if I do that, on the bottom, and I don't have it illustrated here, is a big sphere of wax that's going to turn into a sphere of bronze later. This is our feed ball. When the bronze cools, it shrinks, just like the wax will shrink when it cools, and this will be a terrible problem if you don't accommodate it. It's very important that we premeditate where the bronze is going to flow, where it's going to cool fastest. The last place it cools, you're going to get cavitation. The cooling wax will shrink and it'll pull away from that last spot. And if I didn't have a big feed ball here, these large masses of bronze will be the last places to cool, and somewhere in here it's going to pull away from the surface. So each head is going to have an ugly void in the sun. But because I have a feed ball, this is going to be the last thing to cool. These heads will slowly pull bronze through these feed screws here, and they'll have beautiful full cast surfaces. A sign of a successful cast is that the feed ball has an ugly void where the cavitation pulled away from the outside. One more point on this guy is this marker right here, 3-inch minimum. I'm counting 3 inches from the bottom of my styrene cup to the top of my piece. If I have my piece coming taller here, I'm going to start losing detail. One of the things that is accomplished in this pattern is that pressure builds up. You've poured your hot bronze into the piece. It really forces itself into all the surface details down here. But if there's not a lot of pressure on it, it won't go into the surfaces. Things like way up here, it's kind of sitting casually against the sides of this and not being pushed into any pores on the sides. So especially for detailed pieces, you cannot have a shallow mold. It's got to be deep enough so that the bronze is forced into those spaces. So once all that stuff is taken care of, we're ready to start our ceramic shell process. Ceramic shell is a relatively modern process started around World War II in England, which replaces plaster investment casting for a lot of applications. Prior to that, you had sand casting and the plaster method, which are fine methods for a lot of things, but there are certain drawbacks to those. The biggest drawback to the plaster investment, and you may remember this process where people have a large cylinder of plaster that they're pouring bronze into, and I'll show some pictures of that later, is that those things weigh a ton. A piece this size, I would have to have probably 4 times the weight of my ceramic shell in plaster for that. And if it weighs that much and it's 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm going to have a big problem moving that around before the casting. Manipulate these pieces so I can have a piece 2 foot across, and it's not going to kill me to lift that hot piece while I'm wearing my Kevlar gloves. we've got a drum down here. And this drum is about a 35-gallon capacity in which I've got this perpetually mixed solution of green sludge. This is a water-based solution with a colloidal silica in there and very fine flint. This is bought from Ransom & Randolph. It's one of the more expensive parts of the process. Certainly it's more expensive than plaster, but not a terminally expensive thing. To fill this drum is probably going to be $200, $300 maybe, but I can get a lot of cast pieces out of one of these drums. Normally this stuff also has to be stirred perpetually. If you let that motor stop, and this is the motor I have here for this is the gear motor, by the way, the solids in the solution will settle to the bottom, and it's very hard to bring it back into solution. The professional foundries will let these run for decades without stopping it. They'll just keep adding more stuff, and they'll let it run for a month at a time when they don't need it. But if I don't want to let this run for a month at a time, I can probably turn it off as long as I take out the rotor, because if I leave the rotor in there, say there's a power outage, it'll get seized in place, and that's a big problem. So I have to take a second stir with a second rotor to start bringing it back into solution before it's loose enough that I can start the first rotor again. For saving money, if you don't want to spend on a gear motor, we've got a drill press. That's my second trick here. This is a full sanding drill press from like 1950, so it's a little bit louder, but it'll do a gorgeous job of keeping your slurry in motion. This is another photo of the same setup. After each dip, I'll let most of the stuff drain off, and then I've got bins of sand going because that's part of the process. It's about 10 layers of the slurry dip, and after each one, I will coat it with sand and then let them dry. After they're completely dry, I'll go back and recoat. It's going to be a total of 11 coats for the mid-sized stuff. If you're casting very small pieces, you can get away with 5, so that the casting is about a 1/4 inch thick wall. But if you're casting larger objects, like for a monument or tombstones, if you wanted to cast some bronze grave plaques, you want it close to 1/2 inch thick.
Quick question.
Yeah.
If you were doing pieces in solid, how would that affect this? In other words, if you're doing pieces of bronze that, let's say, were hypothetically an inch thick,
it would not affect it. This process is
would a sand or a different process be better for?
Once you've set up to do
like
one
table
process,
legs, for example. If you wanted to do table legs and you didn't want to have any air inside, in other words, you wanted them solid.
if you want to cast them solid, it's more important to have those feed balls set up,
okay,
so that you don't have cavitation issues. You can do such objects in any of the 3 methods, but the thing is, once you've chosen on which method, you want to try to use it for all of your casting rather than tool up unnecessarily for
correct.
everything.
Okay.
I've chosen this one for the reasons I've mentioned,
Gotcha.
and it's versatile enough I can do those other things as necessary. I mentioned about feed balls before. This is a different aspect of that. Here I'm casting some automotive parts, and I've got this object on the outside. This is a riser where it's doing the same purpose as the feed ball here. I just consolidated 3 of them. That's a lot of metal there, which is all right for this purpose. I wanted to be absolutely sure of proper heat gradient through the casting, and this can be remelted later. So once you've got a batch of bronze going, among different casting processes, you don't have to worry about extraneous stuff like this. It's not lost metal. You're going to just reuse it later on. Simple diagram of the burnout kiln. This is basically IFB, an insulated fire brick shell that's heated up to 1600 degrees. After it's up to that degrees, I'll take my ceramic shells, such as this one here, put it in with some holes in it, upside down, right into here. And I'll get big plumes of smoke coming out as I'm combusting the wax off of there. If you want to recover some wax, you can, and a lot of the professional foundries will have a cooled metal plate down here, so that as that wax melts before it burns, it hits the plate, it kind of runs off, and we can have a cast bowl on the outside through a little exit hole down there. But most of the wax for smaller jobs is going to be burned off, and it is sometimes just not worth your time to worry about recovering it. Just let it all go, it'll combust. I mentioned some holes. I put some here and here, here and here. This is to assist with that wax expanding. One of the issues with ceramic, and also with the other methods, is that wax will expand during the burnout cycle, and the ceramic doesn't really bind up, it doesn't fire to its hard strength until well above the temperature of that melting wax. So there's a risk of the shells cracking when we go in to burn the wax out. To deal with that, that's why we have the temperature so high, so that we put it in there. The outside surface of the ceramic is gonna fire and harden before we even start to melt the wax. And because of that super fast heat, the outside surface of the wax will melt away before we start warming and expanding most of the wax on the inside of this piece. That's how they do the burnout for ceramic. For the plaster investment process, it's more casual. You don't need a high temperature. You do need a long, long time to do it. For a piece this size, you want probably 3 days at 1,000 Fahrenheit to slowly melt that wax out, burn it out, and get all the vapors out of ceramic. I'm sorry, out of the plaster. The ceramic is a lot friendlier. This burnout takes all of 15 minutes. So I'll do that burnout. I'm taking these out again, and then I'm going to plug these holes with more of the same slurry material. You can mix that green sludge with some of the sand that goes with it to make sort of a patching putty, and we'll patch the holes. And if there are any cracks along here, we'll patch those as well. It's important that there are no holes, because later when we get to the bronze casting, we'll squirt out holes and squirt out cracks and so forth. One of the virtues of the ceramic is, even if I have a piece that's cracked, maybe I grabbed it wrong and I cracked off one of these vents, I'll just patch it before the casting process. So we've burned out our ceramics, and we're going to start the bronze casting process. Here we've got a simple burnout oven back here, and I've got these ceramic shells reheated to about 1200 degrees. You can go hotter than that, but I mentioned the coring process when you're wanting to cast things hollow. That core material doesn't like to go over 1350 Fahrenheit. So that's why we'll stay a little bit under there, because that gypsum will be affected if we go too hot. The ceramic itself, it's good up to 2000. Technically, if you wanted to cast steel or stainless steel, the ceramic will deal with that, but we're gentler because we don't need it. Bronze is a much more friendly material. This is a furnace I got propane fired, where I've got my crucible in there heated up to 2050 Fahrenheit, which is the average temperature for these mid-quality bronzes. For very thick castings like table legs and so forth, you don't need but 1950 Fahrenheit. But if you're casting things with a lot of fine detail, including like jewelry grade detail, probably 2150 Fahrenheit is as hot as you want to go. If you try to go any hotter than that, or you let that thing sit there too long because you're busy with other processes, you're going to get extra gas absorption in the bronze, and then you'll have some pores in your castings because those gases were trapped in there.
In other words, bubbling.
Definitely.
Okay.
So here I'm pouring into that. I've moved that ceramic shell into a bucket, and there's sand at the bottom of this bucket to help keep this thing stable. Some folks would like to have maybe some bits of steel chain and the wrapping just to keep them in position for that casting process. When you've poured it, sorry, I have missing some of my stuff here. This is a sample crucible. This is graphite. This is a number 10 crucible, which is probably as big as you want to go for a single person casting. They've got, of course, crucibles, room-sized stuff, but you need a lot of special equipment to do that. For this size crucible, this is tongs for it, and these are homemade tongs. It's simple enough to bend and shape steel. You've got TIG welder going, so that's what you're going to use for that stuff. And it'll come grip it around the sides, pull it out of the furnace, and then I'll set it into a pour shank. The pour shank is essentially a circle of steel with a handle coming down this way. So I'll pick it up from there and then be pouring it into the ceramic shells. I will mention at this point that you always want to have a bucket of water nearby in case you burn yourself. You also want to have a bucket of dry sand nearby. If for some reason there's a crack here and bronze is spilling out, you grab your spare bucket of sand and you completely surround this thing with sand, and you can save your casting. You can still get a good casting out of this. There's a risk of a little loss of detail because you're losing pressure of the bronze, of the liquid bronze. But I've more often than not saved castings by having that bucket of sand nearby.
You can chase that detail back in later, can't you?
Yes, but it's time. And the whole process is about doing things without a killer amount of extra time. One of the more time-consuming aspects using the ceramic shell is breaking off the investment. Here Steve is using a hammer and chisel. He's got a variety of castings. You can see this is the top of the sprue tree where that that styrene cup was, and this piece of bronze is just the shape of that. And he's chiseling off all the extra material. With the plaster process, it's looser, softer material, so it comes off easier, but I still favor the ceramic because it's not a terribly difficult. It'll take about half an hour to chisel off all of the shell, and the bits that remain in there, those will take care of with a sandblaster. So here are some sample pieces after a typical casting. These are wolf heads, about 2.5 inches long. And you can see we've still got some bits of ceramic in the deeper recesses that we'll take care of with the sandblaster. These are very thin pieces. In the thinnest spots, they're about 1/8 of an inch thick, these lines, and there are pins back. These are for some medieval reenactment purposes. This is a crossbow bolt head too. The golden color on that's not going to stay there. It'll slowly patina out into a darker brown, typical of what you'd see on bronzes. To keep that, you want to perpetually burnish it, wax it, and so forth. I'm going to show you some bad examples. So if your shell process didn't work out, you missed something, or it was mishandled and you cracked something, you can lose a lot of pressure. This was a beautiful period fleur-de-lis belt buckle, which is about 2 inches wide and 5 inches long, and it had cast completely, but then the mold cracked right, think about right here, and most of the bronze over here flowed out. We lost all of our pressure, and so we get a lot of ugly cavitation pushing out from gases at the surface of the thing. So that's one way that it'll fail. Another way that it'll fail, the piece back here, one of the students was using not a wax original, but a plastic original. Plastic, like with some beeswax and other polymers, has a lot of impurities that don't completely burn out even at the high temperatures. Will leave some residue. Bronze will flow in, hit that, and form some corroded surfaces or some extra gases that will push away and make a really nasty casting. So that concludes the first chapter of this, talking about the general process. Now we're going to go into making some of your own equipment cheaper than what you can buy things. This is about the simplest possible version of a furnace, where somebody took the propane torch with the auto light from Home Depot. They took a coffee can, and on the inside they wrapped it with ceramic wool. Ceramic wool is this stuff here. Some of you are very familiar with it, some have seen it. It is microfibers of ceramic. It's good to about 2,400 Fahrenheit. He's getting away with this because it's a maximum heat furnace, but for some applications where you bring the atmospheric temperature to like 2,600, this is not optimal stuff, and it will start to like shrivel away from the inside and melt off. So for our purposes, I would not recommend using this for the inside layer. You're going to want to go with some insulating fire brick, which is this stuff. Rated, it comes in different ratings. 2,300 degrees is usually the lowest one. 2,600 is a nicer one. 2,600 fire brick is adequate to our purposes, and they also sell it at 3,000 degrees, which is good if you want to casting steel or certain other alloys.
So if you were to cut off a barrel or something and go with a small barrel or something like that, you could easily wrap the inside of the barrel with the cotton, and then go inside of the cotton with the fire brick.
You betcha, that would work perfectly.
Okay. Now you're showing something horizontal there.
This guy was using this for a glass application.
Okay. Okay. So, but really, what we're talking about here is more or less vertical then.
Yes, we're going to use a vertical furnace.
Excellent.
Which will be a drum probably 2 foot wide. Whatever, if you decide on a number 8 crucible, which is a little smaller than this, you want to plan your furnace so that you have just enough space around the sides to fit your tongs in, and that'll give you enough space for the hot air to circulate as well.
Okay.
You really don't need it any bigger than that small that is necessary.
Gotcha.
Another way people do it, they'll pick up the portable refractory. It's often rated to 3,000. It's great stuff. It's a lot heavier. It's a little more expensive, but it's also more durable. The same people that sell IFB will also sell the 3,000 degree refractory. Ceramic suppliers sometimes have it too. When you're doing that stuff, you're going to first weld up a basic steel shell, and then you're going to take like a plastic bucket on the inside of the right diameter, hold it in place, and then around that plastic bucket, you're going to pour your refractory. And that way you'll have just the right sides open. It bears mentioning that off of the side of that, you're going to want your vent hole where your venturi is, your feed for the fuel air mixture. It's got to come in fairly low.
And I would think that's what you're showing here.
This is the thing that will come in. So I'm going to have the furnace over here, and right around the base, I'm going to have something. Actually, this is the kind that I use. So I'm going to take a squirrel cage blower, which is a simple spinny thing that will push air in.
Right.
This will be maybe a 2-inch diameter steel pipe, and into the side of that, I'm going to have my propane intake through a smaller steel pipe.
So you start the propane. You have a propane nipple there that just burn. You basically light it and go. Turn your air, have your air already on, and you're set.
Yep. I would start with the propane first.
Correct.
The safer way is to like light a piece of paper, wad it up, and chuck it in that furnace, and then you turn the propane on, and it'll come up the top a lot, and then you turn the air on, and it'll slowly, the flame will come down into the furnace, start turning from a yellow flame to the nice blue flame. Once you got the whole thing going, you're going to check the fuel air mixture by the color of that flame coming off of it. It'll spit green out the top of it, and that tells you you're exactly at the sweet spot. If it's coming out yellow, chances are you've got too much air in your mixture, and you want to like slow down the air feed through a simple dampener on it. And if it's coming out blue, and you can probably smell propane or natural gas at the same time, you just got too much fuel in that mixture.
Yeah.
When your mixture is off, you're not going to achieve that high temperature, 2,400, 2,500 Fahrenheit. It'll drop quickly, and you won't be melting your bronze. You'll just be wasting time and wasting fuel if it's not pretty much exactly at that sweet spot for fuel air mixture.
Let me ask you a quick question. I have some experience working with a large traditional kiln that you fire pottery on. That goes to $2,500, $3,000. Can you use something like that as a to basically melt the metal, or is that?
And that's an electric powered?
Yeah.
No. That's gonna leave too much time for that bronze between the 1700 range where it starts to melt and the 2000 degree range where you're ready to
It could take
pour.
6 or 7 hours, yeah.
And you're putting so many impurities into that.
Okay.
And also it's worth mentioning that you don't want to use an electric kiln for the burnout oven. It only needs to go to 12 to 1600 Fahrenheit, but when you're burning wax out, those plumes of uncombusted wax, you'll get hydrogen embrittlement of your nichrome wire, and you'll destroy the coils. You'll be able to crack them apart in your hands.
Oh, nice.
It doesn't work for that.
Gotcha.
The cheapest way to get that burnout kiln is find a broken even heat kiln.
Okay.
Throw away the nichrome wire and just put a hole in the bottom of it for your air and your propane to go in.
Gotcha.
You find one for $100, it's been rotting in somebody's backyard for 10 years.
Yeah.
You're in the zone.
Okay.
I wanted to include a tilt furnace frame because if you're going to go gung-ho with really big heavy castings that are too heavy for you to pick up with your tongs, you can cast in a tilt furnace where you don't have to pick it up. This is the outside frame and an axle across the top, and this will house your poured refractory and a big fat crucible so that after everything is mixed up, you can crank it down and pour the bronze off of it without having to pick up. One of the issues with this is you got to have your receiving investment in just the right spot, or you got to have a little gutter. So you make a little gutter that runs down over to the top of your investment. When people do sand casting in the massive factories, you'll often see that long gutter going. That's how they're getting from their massive tilt furnace to the top of a multi-thousand-pound sand casting mold.
Okay. Wow.
To show off something, this is a college setup where they got slightly larger, a 2-person setup, and they've got a chain hoist, so they're grabbing that crucible that weighs, it's probably holding 100 pounds of molten bronze. They'll pull it out of here, they'll set it down, and here they've got their plaster investments ready to go. These were in a nearby burnout oven that they were sitting in for a week because that's one of the prices of using the plaster investment. So after they've got those out, they can also take their time with moving that bronze into position. Here they are setting that crucible down with a 100-pound melt so that the 2-person team are going to pick it up on both sides, still with a crane assist, and pour it into these things. So they're big, heavy castings, and they can take their time because the plaster investment, it stays hot on the inside for a long time. When I'm doing the ceramic shell process, these things, they will cool quickly. So I want to bring it out, bring over the bronze, and pour it inside of a minute before this thing gets cooler. If I let this cool too long, I'm just going to start losing detail. That's one of the reasons why sand casting cannot achieve the high detail even when you use a fine sand, because it's a room temperature sand and that molten metal is cooling too fast to really get into the pores. At this time I'm going to talk about the alloys that we're going to use for this. I mentioned silicon bronze, which is the industry standard. All the major foundries are using it. You can find maybe some bearing bronze in England and a few other places, but most have gone to silicon bronze, which is a relatively modern alloy. It's 95% copper, 4% silicon, and 1% manganese. The traditional bronze was a tin copper mixture, but silicon, it melts at a lower temperature. It welds beautifully. You hardly need to clean it up. It's very malleable, it's not brittle, it's the dream metal for these kind of applications.
What's your opinion of yellow bronze, say, or some of the other bronzes?
Aluminum bronze, which is that kind of a yellowish hue, it's got up to like 7% aluminum in it. It's cheaper, it also melts low temperature, but aluminum is incredibly difficult to weld, and it translates over too. So you've got your complex castings, and you'll be begging that you had done it in some other alloy. Some people want to do save some money by not using some new ingots, because you can go to a scrapyard and pick up some bronze. Maybe your Uncle Joe Bob has a pile in the backyard, but he's not sure what it is, and you could try it. But there are some big issues there. If there's some brass in there, you've got zinc in that brass, and if you bring it up to that bronze temperature, you're going to see some billowing white smoke off of that. You can take a good inhale of that and die.
Okay.
Another issue of mixing bronzes, some leaded bronzes, you mix them with the silicon bronze, they'll form lead silicate, which is this crusty glass-like material that forms in veins that will crack apart in your casting. It's really bad to mix random alloys of bronze.
Okay.
And at $5 a pound, it's much better off to buy some new stuff.
Okay.
Alloys,
That's all it
metals.
costs is $5 a pound.
When you buy it from some of the better suppliers, yes, you can find people who will sell it to you at $15 a pound.
Sure.
But you got to know that even now, 2012, it's still $5 a pound.
Okay.
From the bigger industrial suppliers.
Okay.
Oh, let's see. We're going to head over to monument casting now. So this is the small and large of the Urania statue out in the lobby of the Amway Hotel here, where it started with about a 12-inch tall maquette. This is all modeling clay. I just painted it on there conceptually where I'm doing some glass inlay, which is not really relevant to this process, but it's the most recent bronze casting, so this is the one I'm going to use. And I've pre-planned it so that she's exactly 1/4 of the size of the large one. This will make the enlargement process a little easier if it's a specific multiple in sizes. There are different techniques for that enlargement. This is a pantograph, which is basically a sliding steel or aluminum frame where I've got some bits here and here and a little needle right here that's in proportion to this bigger needle right here. So I've got, I'm measuring maybe 1 inch or 2 inches from the base here, and it translates into 4 times as high over here. There are a variety of ways to do this. I'm going to show you somebody else's plan. If that's a little too complicated, here's one where the guy simply has some vertical rulers and a little sliding bit, and then a horizontal ruler this way and this way. So he'll measure maybe up a foot and this way a foot, and then he'll go over to his larger one and make the proportional measurements. And then switch back to the first one, hit some more details on it. This table has a pivot right in the center, and the table at the bottom has a pivot right in the center. So that after I've done a few measurements, I can slide this one a 1/4 way and slide this one a 1/4 way. This way I can approach measurement points from every side of it. I've started by putting down some steel mounting feet on it, and onto those feet, I'm going to slowly build the skeleton for a piece. TIG welder is adequate. MIG welder is a little bit easier because you don't have an offhand rod that you can hold. You can simply hold each piece of steel with one hand and fire it with the MIG welder with the other to add some steel to it. This piece is a 2-inch square tube, which is a nice thing to use. It's very tolerant. You can pretty much use scrap steel at this point. Anything with a little strength will be fine. An important thing to note is that we're going to add some ways for clay to grab onto it so it doesn't slide around too much. Here I'm starting to add clay. And for a life-size statue, it's easy to use about 300 pounds of modeling clay. But last I checked, you can still buy it like 60, 70 cents a pound from some suppliers. Don't go to Michael's craft store when you're buying 300 pounds. You know, shop around some until you find the right places. It's very important to add here. I've added a little shelf here. Here I've added another shelf here out of some random piece. I've wrapped this one with some wire and then tacked it with the welder every once in a while so that when I build up clay on here and I've got 50 pounds of clay, it's not going to start sliding, it's not going to start twisting. I really want it to be stable through that whole process. Now, this one is a solid clay all around the form, but sometimes you're going to want to cheat. You don't necessarily have to use all 300 pounds. If you're going to cast maybe a horse with a big old belly, first you're gonna like fill out that belly with something besides clay, and then just coat the outside couple inches with your modeling clay. A popular way to do that is to pick up some expansion urethane foam, smooth on in Polytech, and a lot of marine suppliers and other dealers that carry polyester resins will also have some expansion foam. So you might build a cardboard drum around this thing and start mixing and pouring in your expansion foam. It swells up and then it solidifies. And then after an hour, you peel off your cardboard and take a big old knife, slice around the outside until it's just under the right size, and then you can add clay on it. I also want to mention that when you're working this much modeling clay, you want to have a warming oven. Something maybe 140 Fahrenheit. You put that clay in there. What's normally a fairly stiff clay becomes super buttery soft. So you pull it out of your warming oven an hour later, and you slap it on every which way. It cools over another hour, and then it's back up to that fairly stiff dexterity that you can put all your detail into. This is the same statue that we're talking about. Before I've added tapestry, I've just about finished the pointing. Here again is that pantograph that I'm using to measure all the outside points. At this point, I'm going to double check that all the proportions are right. The femur to the tibia, humerus, radius, the skull, all those general proportions are about right. It's a good time to work on posture at this time. There's still some latitude, because you never ever want to start putting in detail until after the natural shape is in place. It relates to a principle in painting. If you've done a lot of oil painting, of figure painting, a common problem is putting in detail, focusing on detail. No, you use the biggest tool that will do the job. You're looking at your eyeballing, oh, it doesn't look quite right. You go ahead and overcompensate. Well, now it doesn't look quite right in the other way, and you compensate back until you've got a natural form. You can also see here a strong point of light. This is something they should have been teaching in art school, and they did not. You've got a sculpture coming along, it doesn't look quite right, you're not sure what to do, turn off all the lights in the room, put one flashlight at some weird location, look at your sculpture again. You're going to see details that you didn't see before. Move your pointer light source to the other side, move it high, move it low, and look at this thing from many angles with those unusual light sources. You're going to see all these subtle plane differences that you didn't catch before, and it makes so much difference for getting your optimum sculpture. So once it's all done, we're going to go through the molding process. We're not going to cast a giant block of rubber around this thing. It's a ridiculous waste of rubber. It won't do the job. We're going to paint on many, many layers. That's about 15 layers, I think. The first layers are going to be some of the regular urethane. I would not go with silicone for this, both because of the price, because of the longevity of the silicone. After it's cast, it tends not to last as long. These silicones will last 20 years. I'm sorry, the urethanes will last maybe 20 years. The silicones, 5 if you're lucky. So stay away from that. These, after the first couple layers are on, I'm going to switch to a fixotropic, which is like a buttery paste, and I'm going to add a little pigment. Here I've added some red pigment to it, and I'm putting on the next coat. This helps us keep track of where we've got which number of coats, because it's easy to lose track when you're adding that much.
Have you tried the coffee?
Somebody's got to drink it.
That's good.
So you can see here this long line as well. This is one of the parting lines for it. We're going to be adding mold shells, rigid shells to this girl, but first we've got to make sure everything is right. One of the things to note about these big ones is that it's so important not to have undercuts in the outside of your rubber, because if you got undercuts, they will lock everything in place, and you end up needing crowbars to pry everything apart, and you probably have some breakage, losing some things. To assure that you don't have undercuts, you put in some vector pins, which is a nice thing to add, which is to say, I will put in a dowel exactly in the direction that I want that front piece to come off of. I'll put another one on the back left, maybe the back right. If I have to have a separate piece down here, I'm going to premeditate exactly what direction that piece is going to have to come off at. That way, I'm going to know where I need to fill so that there are no undercuts without having to throw away gallons and gallons of extra rubber. So once I've got those in and I know what I need to do, and I've got maybe my 15 layers on here, 10 if I want to do it cheap, I'm going to fill in with some super thick rubber. I'll take that thick Tropic and I'll add some more Cabosil to it, which is amorphous silica. Usually you can buy it from the same places. They'll sell it specifically for this purpose. You fold it into your rubber and it turns into an even thicker mixture that you'll take a spatula and say I need to fill in the side of her head so that it'll demold nicely. I'll spatula in all over there. Then maybe I'll take a wood stir stick and a contour so that it's a very smooth surface on the outside. It's going to be so important later. With small pieces, you got a little demolding issue, you just muscle it out. You can't really do that with these big ones without doing serious damage. Once all that's done, it's time for fiberglass. Fiberglass is vile, nasty stuff.
Not really. I have experience with fiberglass and carbon fiber. It's not that bad.
You can say what you like, sir. You can see he's got nitrile gloves on. He's actually got 2 layers on because after 10 minutes, it's eating through the first layer. He'll peel it off and put on the next one. The mask he's got is just for the glass fibers. It's not so much for the polyester. Polyester has got styrene in it, and it's got MEK, methyl ethyl ketone peroxide. Polyester is great stuff for this application, but one of the ways it's toxic, you can't get into your eyes or it'll fry your cornea. You can get permanently blind from the catalyst for polyester resin. You'll go through a lot of it, probably what the price is now, like $35 a gallon in bulk. That's about right. What I've done here, this size, I've taken bolts of fiberglass cloth. I like to chop it up into pieces about 3 inches by 8 inches, and then I'll layer up. So he's adding some of this sloppy polyester mixture to his cloth, and then he'll layer 5 of them, and then he'll put another 5 on here, another 5 here. Other people like to use the chopped strand method, where you have drums of chopped fiberglass that he'll mix into this, and it's a little simpler and faster, but it's messier in that you've got a whole lot of extra strands sticking out everywhere that you're going to have to grind down. After this is all done, he's going to take a Makita angle grinder with probably a 60 grit head on it and start trimming off all the extra stuff. This is what our statue looks like when she's completely covered in fiberglass. And then I've added these exterior support ribs, also in fiberglass. And finally, I've taken steel conduit from Home Depot for these verticals. These are general triangle shapes, each one, so that there's no flex to it later on. Flex like that later on will mean that after all the bronze is cast, each piece will have the wrong flex and it'll be a huge pain in the butt to assemble them. So that's why those are there. After this is done and cast, these will have to be demolded, and you're going to go over those edges with thin wood strips so that you're not just prying it apart in one place. You want to put 20 or 30 wooden chisels in all around the perimeter and then bring the whole thing out together, because there's a lot of force holding this together from that curing process. I forgot to mention some of the release agents. Polyester will eat through the silicon oil, which is a release agent you use for the wax process or for rubber casting. So you're going to want to use PVA, which is polyvinyl acetate. It's available from those Smooth On Polytech like the other stuff. It's a water-based mixture, but it's a plastic. So after your rubber coats are completely done, you're going to paint this stuff on and let it dry. It dries through a thin plastic film, but it's completely impermeable to that polyester resin. of the mold. I'm cutting away any excess stuff, and I'm starting to add sprues on to give it some strength and to provide the places where the air vents are going to be in the casting process. Here you've got that same piece attached to the sprue tree and to the steel handle set in place. This is before I added my ear vents. I'm about in mid-process now, being very sure that all my joints are properly and strongly welded together. Down here, this is actually the belt piece for that statue. Here again is that sprue piece, the main tree and the styrofoam cup, and I've got some extra feed bars here to distribute bronze along that bottom side. She took this many pieces. Here we have the entire sculpture. This is one life-size bronze broken up into enough pieces that one person can cast everything. So that's like 11 pieces. You know, you can kind of see that this is a piece of draped cloth. This is another one. Here we have an arm. This complex bit is a sensor top and bottom. This is her head right here. You can see her nose right there, chin, and this is the hair bun around back. There's actually a lot of open pores here because I'm doing that glass process where I want a lot of insets. This is one of the air vents coming all the way up the top, and the other one, because I always want 2 per cup for that torsion stability. I keep a fan on these guys so that I can speed up the drying time a little bit. It takes about 3 days to go through the shell building process from all the steps of dipping in the slurry, dipping in the sand, letting it dry, and repeating. So we've already gone through the bronze casting process, so I'm going to skip over that and get right to the last notes on assembly for your monumental statues.